Imagine fighting a war for 30 years. Imagine surviving a car crash off a cliff, only to step into a darkness you never escape. We think we understand the world. We think we know where the ground ends and the danger begins. But sometimes the human mind breaks in ways we can't predict. And sometimes the ground opens up beneath our feet. Today we're telling two stories. One about a soldier who refused to surrender even after the world had moved on. And one about a man who survived the unthinkable, only to vanish into a hole that shouldn't have been there. If you're new here, we explore the strange, the dark, and the mysterious every single week. So if that sounds like your kind of journey, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. You won't want to miss what comes next. December 26, 1944, a young Imperial Japanese Army intelligence officer named Hiroo Onoda stood on the deck of a military aircraft, staring down at the thick green jungle of Lubang Island in the Philippines. He was 22 years old. He had been given explicit orders: disrupt enemy operations, destroy the airstrip, and most importantly, never surrender. Never take your own life. Fight until the very end. When he landed, the island was already under heavy attack by Allied forces. Within days, the Japanese military withdrew. Ships pulled away from the shore. Planes disappeared over the horizon. But in the chaos of retreat, Onoda and 3 other soldiers, Private Yuichi Akatsu, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, and Private First Class Kenshichi Kazuko were left behind. They watched from the jungle as their own forces vanished into the sea. At first, they assumed reinforcements would come. They waited. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. No one came. They built shelters from bamboo and palm fronds. They survived on bananas, coconuts, and the occasional cows stolen from local farmers. They moved constantly, never staying in one place for more than a night. They knew the jungle better than anyone. They became ghosts. But the war was ending. By August 1945, Japan had surrendered. The world celebrated. But deep in the jungle of Lubang, there were no radios, no newspapers, just 4 men clinging to their orders. Leaflets began to rain from the sky. American and Filipino forces dropped pamphlets in Japanese, declaring that the war was over. Onoda picked one up. He studied it carefully. He turned to Kazuka and said, "It's propaganda. The enemy wants us to come out so they can capture us." They burned the leaflets. More leaflets followed. Then photographs. Then letters from their families pleading with them to come home. Onoda examined every single one. He found inconsistencies. He convinced himself they were forgeries. By 1949, one of the 4 men Akatsu could no longer endure. He slipped away from the group one night and surrendered to Filipino forces. The others assumed he had been captured or killed. It only reinforced their belief that the enemy was still hunting them. In 1952, letters and photographs were dropped with official Japanese government seals. Onoda's own family had written to him. But Onoda had a simple response. "If the war had really ended, my commanding officer would come to relieve me himself. A letter is not an order." And so they waited. By 1954, the group had dwindled to 3. They continued their guerrilla campaign, burning rice stores they believed were intended for enemy troops, engaging in skirmishes with what they thought were enemy soldiers. But those soldiers were actually Filipino police and local farmers. Onoda believed he was defending his country. In reality, he was terrorizing an island that had been at peace for nearly a decade. Onoda first arrived on Lubang. He and Kazuko were conducting another sabotage operation. They had done this hundreds of times. Set a fire, cause a distraction, melt back into the jungle. But this time, something went wrong. As they crept through a rice field, a Filipino patrol spotted them. Shots rang out. Onoda hit the ground and crawled toward the tree line. Behind him, he heard Kazuka scream. He turned. Kazuka was on the ground, his rifle still clutched in his hands. A single bullet had struck him in the chest. Onoda wanted to go back. Every instinct told him to drag his comrade to safety. But the gunfire was relentless. He watched Kazuka's body go still. And then he ran. For the first time in nearly 30 years, Onoda was completely alone. After Kazuka's death, the search intensified. The Filipino government sent patrols. The Japanese government sent search parties. Loudspeakers broadcast messages in Japanese: "Hiroo Onoda, the war is over. Please come out." Onoda heard them. He heard his name echoing through the jungle. And he did something remarkable. He convinced himself it was a trap. He moved deeper into the jungle, finding an underground cave where he could hide. He survived on bananas and stolen rice. He read a letter from his mother that he had kept folded in his pocket for decades. He spoke to himself to keep his mind from fracturing, but in the quiet moments in the dark of the cave, he must have wondered. He must have asked himself, what if it's true? What if the war ended long ago? He never allowed himself to answer. Then, in February 1974, a young Japanese adventurer named Norio Suzuki decided he wanted to find three things: a lost Japanese soldier, a wild panda, and the abominable snowman. He started with the soldier. Suzuki traveled to Lubang Island, hiked into the jungle, and began searching. Remarkably, after 4 days, he found Onoda. Suzuki approached carefully. He called out in Japanese, "Onoda-san, I am here from Japan. The war is over. Your family's waiting." Onoda emerged from the cave, his rifle raised. He looked at Suzuki, a young man with no military uniform. No weapon, just a camera and a kind face. They talked for hours. Suzuki told him about Japan, about skyscrapers and bullet trains, about how the world had changed. But Onoda shook his head. He repeated the same words he had said for 3 decades. "I am still under orders. I cannot surrender until my commanding officer relieves me." Suzuki returned to Japan and found Onoda's former commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. Taniguchi was now a civilian, quiet man who ran a bookstore, but he agreed to go. On March 9th, 1974, Taniguchi stood in the jungle clearing and faced the man he had left behind 30 years earlier. Onoda emerged from the cave. He was dressed in his original uniform, tattered, faded, held together with vine and string. His rifle was clean. His ammunition was still dry. He walked to Taniguchi, stopped, and saluted with the precision of a man who had never stopped training. Taniguchi read the official orders. "By order of the Emperor and the Supreme Commander of the Imperial Japanese Army, you are hereby relieved of duty. You will cease all combat operations immediately." Onoda stood perfectly still for a long moment. Then his shoulders began to shake. He lowered his rifle. He wept. He'd spent 10,849 days in the jungle. He'd killed at least 30 people and wounded over 100. He had fought a war that no one else was fighting, and now finally it was over. When he returned to Japan, he was greeted as a hero. Crowds lined the streets. Television crews followed his every move, but the welcome was complicated. The families of the people he had killed in the Philippines demanded answers. Some called him a war criminal. Others called him a symbol of loyalty. Onoda struggled to adjust. The sounds of the city overwhelmed him. He couldn't sleep in a soft bed. He couldn't understand a world without orders. He eventually moved to Brazil, where he became a cattle rancher. He wrote an autobiography called No Surrender, My 30-Year War, and in 2014, at the age of 91, he died of heart failure. Hiroo Onoda was not a monster. He was a man whose mind was so deeply bound to his duty that he could not see the truth, even when it was raining from the sky. His story is a reminder that the longest wars are often the ones we fight inside ourselves. April 19th, 1958, Santa Cruz, California. Frank Hiscu was 22 years old. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the easy confidence of a young man who had just started building his life. He worked hard. He loved his wife. And in just a few months, he was going to be a father. That evening, Frank drove his pickup truck along West Cliff Drive with 2 friends. They had spent the day at the beach and exhaustion had settled into their bones. The windows were down. The Pacific Ocean stretched out to their right, invisible in the darkness, but audible in the constant rhythm of waves against rock. West Cliff Drive was beautiful in daylight, a winding road that hugged the coastline, offering panoramic views of Monterey Bay, but at night it was treacherous. There were no streetlights, no guardrails in some sections. It's just asphalt, darkness, and the long drop to the ocean below. Frank's friends were half asleep in the passenger seat. Frank himself was fighting to keep his eyes open. He thought about his wife, Margaret, waiting at home. She was pregnant with their first child. She always waited up for him. He didn't want to keep her waiting, so he pressed the accelerator a little harder. He didn't see the curve. It came out of nowhere, a sharp bend in the road that his headlights, so it didn't catch until he was already in it. Frank slammed on the brakes. The truck shuddered but didn't slow fast enough. He jerked the steering wheel. The tires screamed against the asphalt. His friends woke up, screaming. The truck spun. Frank watched in helpless horror as his headlights swept across the metal barrier at the edge of the cliff. For one terrible moment, he thought they might stop. But the truck slammed through the barrier, and suddenly there was nothing beneath them but air. The fall lasted less than 3 seconds, but Frank would later say it felt like an eternity. He squeezed his eyes shut. He heard his friends screaming beside him. He braced for the impact of water, for the cold rush of the ocean pouring through the windows, dragging them down into darkness. But the impact never came. Instead, the truck slammed into something solid. The jolt threw Frank against his seatbelt. The truck bounced once, then settled. Frank opened his eyes. The truck was tilted at an angle, but it wasn't moving. Through the windshield, he could see nothing but darkness and the distant glint of moonlight on water. He looked at his friends. They were pale, shaking, but alive. "Everyone okay?" Frank whispered. His friends nodded, unable to speak. One of them opened the passenger door carefully and peered outside. He leaned back in, his face caught somewhere between disbelief and terror. "We're on a ledge," he said. The truck caught on a ledge. Frank slowly climbed out of his seat and looked out. The ledge was about 20 feet below the road, just wide enough to catch the truck. If they had fallen another foot to the left, they would have plummeted another 50 feet into the ocean. If they had fallen to the right, they would have hit the rocks below, but they hadn't. By some miracle, they had landed exactly where they needed to land. Frank let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Relief washed over and he started to laugh. His friends laughed too, the shaky, hysterical laughter of people who had just stared death in the face and blinked first. They climbed out onto the ledge, standing on solid rock for the first time since the fall. The road was just above them. They could hear cars passing occasionally. All they had to do was flag someone down, call for help, and they'd be home by morning. Frank's two friends stood on the passenger side of the truck, leaning against the cliff wall, catching their breath. Frank decided to climb out on the driver's side. He tried the door. It was jammed against the rock. No problem. He rolled down the window. Frank swung his legs out the window and lowered himself onto the ledge. His friends saw his silhouette through the cab of the truck. They saw him land on the rock, and then he was gone. One moment he was there. The next, the space beside the driver's side door was empty. His friends called out, "Frank? Frank, where are you?" No answer. They walked around the truck carefully, their feet finding purchase on the uneven rock. When they reached the driver's side, they stopped. The ledge was not solid. It was porous, honeycombed with holes and fissures carved by decades of waves. One of those holes was directly beside the driver's side door. It was dark. It was roughly the size of a man's shoulders, and it descended straight down. Frank's friends dropped to their knees and shouted into the hole. For a moment there was silence. Then they heard it, Frank's voice echoing up from somewhere deep below. He'd fallen into a cave, a natural cavern carved into the cliff by centuries of ocean currents. He was alive. He was conscious, but he was trapped. "Get help," Frank shouted. "Hurry!" His friends scrambled up the cliff face to the road. They flagged down a passing motorist. Within minutes, police and rescue teams arrived. The cave system beneath West Cliff Drive was not well mapped. Rescue workers lowered flashlights on ropes trying to see the layout. They called down to Frank. His voice was faint, but they could hear him. So he was moving. He was trying to find a way out. But the cave was a labyrinth. Narrow tunnels branched off in multiple directions. Frank wandered deeper into the rock, trying to find an exit, not realizing that every step was taking him farther from the only opening. Time became the enemy. The Pacific Ocean does not wait. The tide began to rise. Rescue workers shouted down to Frank, "The water's coming. Find the entrance. Follow the sound of our voices." But in the darkness of the cave, sound was deceptive. Frank's own voice bounced off the walls, echoing in ways that made it impossible to tell which direction was up. He was disoriented. He was panicking, and the water was rising. The cave filled from the bottom. Inch by inch, the cold Pacific began to flood the chambers. Frank's shouts became more desperate. Rescue workers lowered ropes, but he wasn't near the opening. He couldn't reach them. For 2 hours, the rescue teams tried. They lowered lights. They lowered ropes. They shouted instructions, but Frank was lost in the maze beneath the cliff. At 2 a.m., the tide reached its peak. The cave system was fully submerged. Frank's voice went silent. His wife, Margaret, was waiting at home. She never got the call that he was safe. Instead, she got the call that they couldn't find him. At first light, divers descended into the cave. They navigated the narrow tunnels with flashlights, pushing through the cold, dark water. They found Frank's body just a few feet from where the rescue workers had been standing the night before. He had been so close. In the darkness and the panic, he had been just a few feet away from the opening, but he couldn't see it. The water had risen, and he couldn't hold his breath long enough to find his way out. Frank Iscu survived a 70-foot fall off a cliff. He survived the impact. He survived the initial terror. He was rescued by a rocky ledge that should not have been there. But in the end, it wasn't the fall that killed him. It was the ground beneath his feet.